All right, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, Security Boulevard webinar. Thanks for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon. I'm the moderator, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great webinar on tap. This is going to be a great one, I can tell you already. But before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of it, you will have the opportunity to access it later on. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for either or any of our speakers, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your question and answer interface on the web interface, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can near the end of today's webinar. We also have 3 polling questions during the course of the webinar today, so hopefully we can get everybody engaged with those. And near the end of today's webinar, we are going to be doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So hopefully you will be one of our 4 lucky winners, so please stick around. All right, with that, let's go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is 3 supply chain attacks from 2020 not named SolarWinds. Our speakers today are Amnon Evans-Zohar, who is the Director of Product Management at SciCode, Andrew Fife, who is the VP of Marketing at SciCode, and Ronan Slavin, who is the CTO and co-founder of SciCode. I'm sorry. With that, Andrew, I'm going to turn it over to you because apparently I'm tripping over my tongue left and right. So I'll let you get right to it.
No worries. Thanks so much, Charlene. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. I think we have a really important topic. Everybody out there, no doubt, has heard of SolarWinds. It's had a massive impact. And everybody's trying to scramble and figure out how should we respond to it. But the fact of the matter is that SolarWinds is one of many supply chain attacks that have occurred over the last couple of years, and supply chain attacks, frankly, are on the increase. So what we wanted to do was take a little bit of time and break down a couple of other software supply chain attacks so that we can find some of the lessons and some of the commonalities as to how we as software vendors can protect ourselves from becoming used as vectors in future supply chain attack. As Charlene mentioned, my name is Andrew Fife. I do run marketing here at SciCode and spent the majority of my career marketing for security and security adjacent products. I'll let Amnon introduce himself.
Hey everyone, and thanks Andrew. As Andrew mentioned, my name is Amnon. I'm Director of Product Management at SciCode. Vast experience in the cybersecurity and product management side, and happy to be here today.
And we do have, as Charlene mentioned, a bonus presenter in Ronan Slavin, who is our CTO. Ronan, do you want to tell people quickly about your background?
Yeah, sure. So hey everyone, I'm Ronan Slavin. I'm the CTO and co-founder at SciCode. I've been working on cybersecurity for about 8-9 years, both from offensive and defensive perspective. Very excited to hear this webinar, and good luck, Amnon and Andrew.
All right. So we'll jump in and we'll do our first poll question.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and push it out now. The question is, how important is protecting your organization from being compromised as a software supply attack vendor? The polling question is in your polling section there on the interface. You can go ahead and make your choice between top overall priority, high priorities, average, low priority, or not a priority at all. We'll go ahead and give the audience a few seconds here to go ahead and make your choice, maybe about a minute. And while everybody is making their choice, just a quick reminder that today's event is being recorded. So you will have the opportunity to access the webinar later on, should you decide to. The webinar is also going to be living on the on the Security Boulevard website. You can go to securityboulevard.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section after today's webinar, and it will be there waiting for you. And we'll also be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. All right, we'll just give you guys a couple more seconds and then we'll close it out and we'll take a look at the results. Excuse me.
Yeah, so we phrase this question about priority sort of intentionally. And the thinking behind it is that if we simply asked, is it important to try and protect your organization from being compromised and used as a supply chain attack, of course the answer would be yes, that it is important. But when we ask it relative to priority, what we're trying to figure out is, where does it show up in your stack? What, compared to all the other things that we have to get done, where does protecting our organization from these type of attacks rank? And that's sort of the thinking behind the question. Otherwise, we just get everybody saying, of course it's important.
Right. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and close the poll and we'll take a quick look at the results here. Okay, how important is protecting your organization from being compromised as a software supply attack vector? The majority of folks said it is a high priority. And we had a tie between, that was 40%, and then 25% each chose either a top overall priority, or an average priority. Only 5% each chose low priority or not a priority at all. So obviously, organizations and attendees are understanding the importance of protecting their organization from being compromised as a software supply attack vector. So good stuff there. Andrew, I'm going to put myself on mute now and let you get on with your presentation.
All right, great. Thank you. Okay, so we're gonna spend a little bit of time talking about what a supply chain attack is. Then we're gonna dive deep into 3 different supply chain attacks. One called the Octopus Scanner, another called the Sawfish, and a third called ESLint. And as we go through, we'll talk about some of the lessons that we learned that we think we can take away from each of these attacks. And then ultimately, what we want to do is say, okay, what's the commonality across all these lessons? So from there, we'll spend a little bit more time talking about concrete actions that we think organizations should take to mitigate these types of attacks. And then we'll show you a little bit of one way in which you can mitigate some of them, and ultimately jump in and do some Q&A at the end. So before we get into what is a supply chain attack, I'd like to tell a little story about the 3 Mile Island nuclear disaster, which took place in 1979. 3 Mile Island is a nuclear plant in Pennsylvania in the United States. And at the time, it was the largest nuclear disaster in the history of the world. Certainly Chernobyl and Fukushima have surpassed it since, but it remains the largest nuclear disaster in the history of the United States. And there's a couple interesting security lessons to learn here. So let me give you a quick overview of exactly what happened. What happened is that one of the reactors started to overheat. And as part of the initial procedures to try and cool down the reactor, there was a valve within the reactor, a pressure release valve that was opened. And when that pressure release valve was opened, it did dissipate, some of the heat. And so it did what it was supposed to do. However, when the valve went to close, there was a mechanical blockage which prevented the valve from closing. So the valve did not completely close. The engineers on their control panel had a light bulb that went on whenever that valve was closed. So when the valve, but when the valve went to go close and it was mechanically blocked, the light bulb still went on. So as the engineers are trying to figure out, okay, the reactor's still heating up, we need to move to the next level. The next level of mitigations was to flood it with coolant. And so when they flooded the reactor with coolant, and the light bulb was on, saying that the valve was closed, but yet there was a mechanical blockage that was keeping it open, what happened is that naturally the coolant leaked out. And so it wasn't able to do its job because the valve was open. So as it turns out, what had happened is that the light bulb didn't actually measure whether or not the valve was closed. What it did is it measured a proxy for whether or not the valve was closed. It measured whether or not the valve had electricity, had power running to it, so that it could operate, so that it could be, shut remotely. But it didn't take into account whether or not there was a mechanical blockage. And so what ultimately the engineering team that was on site couldn't understand why the coolant wasn't working, why the reactor was continuing to overheat. And this delayed their ability to find a solution long enough that the nuclear reactor ultimately experienced a partial core disintegration. In fact, the engineering team that was on site was actually never able to figure out what the problem was. And it required a new team coming on site as the shift changed. And that new team starting to think through the problem without some of the biases that the initial team had. Only then were they able to figure out what the problem was. But I think there's a really key takeaway that that's very important when it comes to supply chain attacks here. And that is whatever we're trusting has got to be accurate. And unfortunately, when it comes to security, there's not really a whole lot that you can completely trust. In fact, one of the things that we've been saying is that, you know, ultimately whatever you assume is secure will wind up becoming insecure. So we need to start taking approaches where, you know, more of the trust but verify, where we are layering in reasons to trust. And when you think about supply chain attacks, especially with SolarWinds, you know, the assumption that the certificate from the vendor meant that the code coming in, that the application coming in to my network was good, that's sort of the core issue. And so one of the things that makes these supply chain attacks unique is it really has rattled what we should trust. Now, coming back into tying this back in more directly to how we as software vendors can think about what we trust, a big part of not becoming used as a supply chain attack is starting to think about code tampering. And what we sign in, if we sign a commit in dev, and then we verify the file in the build stage, you know, that can go a long way. But we have to ask ourselves, why are we trusting that signing? And you should only trust that signing if you start thinking about the signing as being the end of the process, not the beginning. So what I mean by that is going into the signing, there are a lot of other components. So how do you manage the keys? How do you know that the person signing it is who they say they are? Are you using multi-factor authentication so that you've got a higher degree of trust, you know, that their account wasn't hacked? It's even further than that. How do you know that this isn't an insider attack? So it's also things like, you know, do you have peer reviews before your code is merged into master? And even goes back into hiring practices in terms of what types of background checks you're doing. So if you think about all of those things, background checks, peer reviews, key management, multi-factor authentication, if we do a good job with all of those are the layers that can give us the confidence to start to trust that signing. But if we don't do all those other steps, then that signing isn't as valuable as it otherwise could be. So I guess that's not my not so quick story, but hopefully that was somewhat helpful and interesting. So what is a supply chain? What is a software supply chain? It's really simple concept. It's everything that's involved in building your application, but not everybody is checking all the boxes here. It's not just you know, your code. I mean, code tampering is a big part of it, but it's all of the different infrastructure and tools, dependencies, people, and processes that go into it. Let's talk about people for a second. Obviously, developers play a big role here, but they're not the only people that have access to our key infrastructure. We've got product managers, we've got DevOps, we've got SRE. So we might think about code tampering only as something that happens with developers, but actually, as we saw in SolarWinds, the attack vector, the initial attack started really in their build system. So there's a lot of different ways that you can get in, and frankly, every single every single tool and every single process that we're using in our supply chain actually becomes part of our attack surface. It's one of the things that makes this tricky. And what is a supply chain attack? So specifically, the traditional attacks are going after the production environment. And because that's been common for a while, you know, we have built up a lot of, shall we say, muscle memory or a lot of focus around how to protect our applications in production. But because software supply chain attacks are a newer phenomenon, not totally new, but a newer phenomenon, we don't have as much muscle memory built up around that. We're not doing as much to protect our infrastructure as we are our production environments. And that's exactly where the software supply chain attacks are targeting. We're targeting how the software is made. We're not actually targeting how it's deployed. So these attacks are different because they are undermining so many things that we trust. How do I know that? I know that we trust them because we simply aren't putting the effort into securing them. You should also think about, these software supply chain attacks. Some of them are very sophisticated. What happened with SolarWinds was very sophisticated, but not all of them are. We'll talk through some that are a little more basic, but it could be as simple as an organization who I won't shame, but in January, a large global auto manufacturer had a Bitbucket server that they hadn't changed the default password for the admin password on it. And so their source code got stolen. That could easily be the start of attack. That's a fairly basic thing, but people get bit by the basics all the time. And unfortunately, the current application security tools that exist out there, are sort of alphabet soup of SAST and DAST and IAST and RASP and container security. They're not really set up well to be able to uncover these types of supply chain attacks. And the main reason is because they tend to be siloed and focused on one specific part of your software development lifecycle. Yet really ultimately preventing supply chain attacks is about integrity between the different phases of your SDLC. So you really have to start comparing information across. And then lastly, as we know, one of the big goals is obviously how can we use code tampering to turn the victim of this supply chain attack into a vector themselves. But of course, there are other examples where people are simply trying to steal intellectual property, or just commit crime through extortion. So there's really kind of a wide range of different goals. And I think that jumps us into poll number 2.
All right, hold on. Okay, there we go. All right, poll number 2 is coming at you right now. It should be available to you. Which phase of your software development lifecycle are you most concerned about attacks to turn your organization into a supply chain attack vector? You can choose from code and development, build, or production. Go ahead and make your choice. And another quick reminder that at any time during today's presentation you have a question for Amnon or Andrew or even Ronan, go ahead and use your question and answer tab and submit your question, and we'll try to get to as many as we can near the end of today's webinar. And we'll go ahead and give the audience a couple more seconds to make its choice. Again, your choices are code and development, build, or production. All right, guys, got lots of responses coming in, so go ahead and get it on in. We've got about 20 more seconds before I'm closing it down. And excuse me, while we are waiting, another quick reminder that today's event is being recorded. So you will have the opportunity to access it later on if you missed any or all of it, or if you just want to watch it again. All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and close it down here in about 10 seconds. All right. Going 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. I've closed the poll. The question was, which phase of your software development lifecycle are you most concerned about attacks to turn your organization into a supply chain attack vector? Looks like 44%, the majority, said the code and development phase, followed by a dead even tie at build, 28% each for build and production, which is kind of interesting, actually.
It is interesting. We've been talking about SolarWinds now for, I don't know, gosh, I guess it's about 2 months. And we've asked this same question a couple different ways in a couple different formats. And right after SolarWinds hit, everybody was really concerned about the build. And I think that's because, frankly, that's how SolarWinds got hit. But now as we start to get a little bit further away from it and the reaction's a little bit less raw, we are seeing a shift towards a focus on code and development. Nobody's forgetting about builder production, but that's interesting to see.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I'll put myself back on mute. Get back to it.
All right. So Amnon, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me well?
Yep.
Awesome. So thanks, Andrew. Yeah. So I think that following or in continuance of what we discussed so far, the SolarWinds breach brought us a dangerous attack vector. But as mentioned, supply chain attacks are not a new phenomenon, and we are witnessing more and more such attacks in the past several years. I wanted to share with you here just a few of them, categorized by common attack vectors, as Andrew mentioned earlier. As you can see here, there are some examples on the open source, other on the build, and some on the production. And even before going and diving into each one of them, or the three that we've mentioned, it's worth mentioning just a few to give you kind of an insight. So if you're looking, for example, on event stream attack or the Ruby gems, these are two attacks that were done actually on open source packages, where malicious code was inserted within the package itself, either by malicious insider or whatever. And from then on, I think that especially in the open source, the impact was really tremendous. So, for example, in event stream, the number saying that the malicious library was downloaded up to 8 million times. Ruby gems is mentioned on more than 100,000 times. So the impact is also something that we were going to discuss later on. Maybe another supply chain attack that's worth mentioning is the CCleaner, which is an interesting one because the CCleaner is actually a software that belongs to Avast, which is itself a cybersecurity solutions. So hackers initially managed to log in to one of the developer's remote desktop using stolen credentials. From then on, they move laterally within the environment, off office hours, so they won't be they won't be identified, and then enter the malicious code and contaminating the CCleaner downloads through a backdoor. So again, a large impact of estimation of more than around 2.3 million successful malicious downloads. So these are just kind of in a nutshell, some examples of supply chains that we've been witnessing throughout the years. And let's now dive into the three that we are looking for. Next slide, please. Great. So as Andrew mentioned at the beginning, we're going to cover three supply chain attacks, very interesting one. We're going to start with the Octopus Scanner attack, then move to the Sawfish phishing campaign, and end up by the ESLint. I want to walk you through that, explain each attack, what is go, and more importantly, what are the lessons that we can take from each one of them, and then kind of summarize so we can all leave this webinar with more of an understanding of what are the next steps that we want to take. Next slide, please. Great. So we're going to start with the Octopus Scanner. This is an attack that was focused and kind of relying on what Andrew mentioned at the beginning. It was not focused on the product itself, but the tool that the products are created. In this case, we're talking about the NetBeans, which those of you who are not familiar with, it's a Java IDE, a Java Integrated Development Environment, commonly used by developers. When reported on this attack, the owners of the infected repositories were actually completely unaware that they were committing such a backdoor to the repositories. It was, if I'm not mentioned, it was discovered in March 2020, so we're talking just a year ago. And there are several things that we can look right now and pay attention. These will be also the things that we'll go through the different attacks that we're going to cover. Number one is that the primary infected users in this attack are the developers. And it's developers because the access that is gained is of a high interest to attackers. Developers generally have access to additional projects or production environment, or even database passwords and other critical assets of the organization. It's also a huge potential for escalation of access of this identity within the organization, which is a core objective of any attacker. The second thing that I want to mention is that the scale and the impact. So developers that actually are NetBeans users became vulnerable in this attack. They exposed their entire GitHub repo to attackers, and regardless of how many GitHub repos were actually being attacked. So this is definitely can address or raise as a big impact. Now, moreover, through the build process, the affected projects were actually presumably got cloned, forked, and used on many other systems. So the artifacts of the build probably spread even further in a way which even created that as a larger impact than we can even discuss or imagine or begin thinking about. Next slide, please. Okay, so if we go a bit on a technical way, just to explain briefly on how this attack occurred. So once the user actually infected by the Octopus Scanner, first the malware was searching for if this IDE, the NetBeans IDE, actually in using the developer. And if it wasn't, then it wouldn't take any actions. If it was, then the malware actually identified where the NetBeans directory is. It enumerated the projects that are associated with that IDE and start copying the payload, what we can see here in the diagram as the file ocs.txt, to the cache that is essentially inserted to the file that are used by the IDE itself. So it was also to make sure or to ensure that any new Java classes or any Java files that were created by this IDE would include this vector continuously. And it even modified the build file in such a way that every build process actually gets or includes this malware, making sure that this process is as sticky as possible with the malware that was infecting. The RAT, the remote access Trojan that was added, actually established a network connection to the attacker-owned command and control servers. It was even sophisticated enough that it wouldn't really help, allow developers to change this malicious code. Now, the result is a much wider scale threat because the infected IDEs were used to infect the source code, which in turn uploaded the source code itself, the infected one, uploaded to the GitHub itself, to the online repos. And repos, as mentioned, can be forked and cloned. So the malware was actually, again, positioned at least to spread exponentially. Now, recovering from this attack was actually also not an easy way. While it was, just simply contacting the developers and the repository owners and asking them to clean their build environments and the build artifacts was not sufficient. And it took a while to actually clean all the different artifacts, jar files, and others to make sure that this malware is off. Next slide, please. So now that we kind of understood, in a high level at least, I hope more, how the Octopus Scanner actually attacked the software supply chain, and we see that it's from a different angle. It's actually attacking the build environment and its artifacts, so it can spread quickly. So with that in mind, I want to highlight the lessons that we can learn from such an attack. And the first one is that, in the poll, the majority of the attendees mentioned that they were concerned of attacking the source code and the source code management. So we need to harden, or the recommendation is to harden the development and build environment. How we do that? Sorry. The first one is by enforcing a least privilege model. What does it actually mean? It means that we want to allow or monitor who has access to which repo and what type of access, which actions this developer can do. We want to make sure that there's no excessive access provided, such that even if a developer identity is being hijacked, then the attacker impact can be minimized because the developer has no excessive rights to do things that is not allowed or not willing or not needed to do. The second one on the hardening is the strong authentication. Multi-factor authentication is definitely a best practice and recommended to make sure that it's not just a username and password. You need another way to authenticate and to access to the account itself. And the third is on the build pipeline, recommended not to be publicly accessible, so attackers cannot really from outside enter your build environment and tamper that. The second lesson learned is about the enforcing branch protection rules. With the ability today for developers to create and merge branches, it also introduces a lot of risk. And in order to minimize this risk and minimize the risk of developers to push insecure content into the Git, source code management platform, GitHub, GitLab, and others introduced these branch protection rules. So two main ideas or two main concepts around that is first is the commit signing as a mandatory configuration, recommended to utilize the signatures of the source code management to ensure that the content that is submitted by the developer that is being pushed is actually not altered and will be the same content that will also then later on propagate to the build and to production. And another one, let's say, aspect of this branch protection rule is to ensure that code is reviewed before merge. So there's another authority that actually looks in the code and prohibiting pushing unreviewed code, making sure that this is also code that does not contain any sensitive data such as private keys, passwords, and so forth. Great. Next slide, please, Andrew. Awesome. So we covered the Octopus Scanner, and now it's time to move to the next attack that we want to share with you. This attack is named Starfish Phishing Campaign. So in April 2020, GitHub repos, were again targeted. But in this case, it was a bit clever attack. It was by a clever phishing tactic, which again targeting developers. And surprisingly, this is also very similar to the previous attack that we were mentioning. The phishing campaign alert actually targeted GitHub users to domains that looked very similar to legitimate GitHub instances. And initially, even without looking into it, they were actually seemed like that, but they were actually just clever fakes. Examples are GitHub, git-hub.co, or sso-github.com, and such. Other domains that were involved in this phishing campaign even misspelled the word GitHub with an L and not an I, and so forth, just to trick the developers and the audience themselves. The phishing emails were claiming the victims' accounts or the repository within them. They mentioned stating that they have been compromised or any other potential unauthorized activity has been detected. And we'll just share with you here below in the screen on this slide 2 examples of such emails that were received by developers to review their activity, or hey, there's any suspicious activity in your account, and check that activity, and then the developer was actually tempted to click on the link. Next slide, please. Now, once the targeted user actually, the targeted developer entered his login into the phishing site, then the attacker, that was where the attacker stole the accounts and the credentials. The selfish attack was sophisticated enough to work even when the user has one-time password-based two-factor authentication. And the way that they did that is actually by relying the codes to the attacker and to the user at the same time in real time. It is, by the way, worth mentioning that, well, these two-factor authentication, the software one was bypassed. if one had used hardware keys, these were not vulnerable to the attack itself. Now, with access to the developer GitHub account, which this is essentially what the attackers did in this attack, the attacker could have done some of the following, and again, each one of them is very impactful. The first one is that they could download the content of the private repos. These are presumably repos that are owned by the organization they work for, so obviously containing valuable code of this organization or any other sensitive information. They could have get the keys to access to the online application, and they could also access any sensitive data within the organization just by leveraging the user identity. And each one of them is, as we can understand, very impactful one. Now, the attackers, as another topic, could have actually kept their access even if the password to this GitHub account was changed. They could do that through GitHub OAuth token or just creating their own GitHub personal access token, which essentially means that it will be very hard to find these attackers and that they could have actually been keeping their access to this account even longer. And by longer, it also means that the damage that they created can be even higher. Next slide. Thank you. So again, just like we did with the Octopus Scanner, let's review the lessons that we learned from the Starfish phishing campaign. So we can see that even if the attacker, or once the attacker gets access to the account itself, we should monitor any activity within this account itself, monitor clones, monitor forks of the repos, and trying to identify any suspicious activity. Examples of such suspicious activity can be a repo that was forked, but used to be private and now was changed to be public. Definitely something that that indicates an abnormal behavior or a risk. Or has the forked or cloned repo included any sensitive information, such as user and password, secrets, and so on, which again increase the risk of such an activity. And third is whether it was cloned as a zip file into the local machine, because again, this is something that indicates at least things that we want to monitor and maybe block. The second lesson learned from this attack is to harden the authentication policies. And it's again, we discussed it also in the Octopus Scanner, using multi-factor authentication, and in this attack specifically, even consider using hardware security keys to get the maximum security for your repository. At least to try and prevent phishing or provide phishing protection, it's also even worth mentioning on the authentication policies to consider using a browser integrated password manager or something around that, at least to provide a degree of phishing protection. When we're talking about enforce least privilege policies, so again, we covered that to reduce the scope of the access, to make sure that developers has only access to the code in the repo that they need, and those that have an excessive access, just revoke it to keep it according to their roles and responsibilities, and to prevent any unneeded actions, or at least minimize that. And the last one is again going back to the branch protection rules. We at least recommend to sign the code commits, run a peer review, make sure that every code that is being pushed to the repo is being reviewed by another party, making sure that this code is secure and does not contain any sensitive information that it shouldn't have. Great. I think it's now time, Andrew, to the next slide, please. And let's cover the third and last attack, which is the ES-linked one. So to those of you who are not familiar with, The ESLint is a widely used static code analysis tool. It is for identifying problematic patterns found in JavaScript code. And it actually covers both code quality and coding style issues. And now in 2018, the ESLint was actually targeted a supply chain attack where the attacker compromised the NPM account of the ESLint maintainer. The way that he did that is actually via a third-party breach, meaning that this ESLint maintainer actually used the same login and password details across multiple accounts and didn't even have any two-factor authentication, which is, one can say maybe a naive approach, but also a not recommended one, and we'll get into that in a minute. So the attacker was able to actually test this leaked login and manage a way to get in to the ESLint account itself. Once compromised this account, he modified the package JSON in two main packages mentioned here in the slide, both the ESLint escope and the ESLint config. And he actually changed the latest versions and added a script, and then added the script and then uploaded that to the NPM registry for other developers that are using this package will actually start downloading that automatically as part of their build process. So once the other developers on installation started using these packages, then the malicious packages were downloaded and executed, which essentially, specifically in this malware, in this attack, the malware was looking for the user's .npm.rc file and to send that to the attacker. Now, it's worth mentioning definitely that such file typically contains access token that are being published to the NPM. Again, kind of the crown jewels that the attacker wanted to get his hands on, and then leverage these to access to additional sensitive systems. Next slide, please. So the impact obviously is a very wide one, and if you're looking just to get some sense of that, on around 2 billion downloads for NPM per day. So in the period of time once this issue started until it was identified, then we were talking about 54 million downloads just for this, presumably for this package, which again just indicates how impactful this was. Now, it's not only a practice of good password hygiene, but it also demonstrates how dangerous malicious code can be unleashed in the packages, in the points that are supposedly trusted, and that most users are actually using without even a second thought. Worse yet, the attackers with the stolen accounts are often able to remain hidden for weeks and months, allowing them space to target additional victims. And they're being kept under the radar and still can be in the account, very similar to other attacks, so they can continue and get more and more, or create more and more damage. Next slide, please. So lessons learned. What is that we're learning from the ESLint attack? So first of all, and this is a bit of something that is was not mentioned earlier, is to maintain high password hygiene. So explained earlier, the attacker used the same username and password in different accounts. Obviously, not a best practice. This scenario should be avoided, and different passwords should be used for different accounts, and also use the multi-factor authentication as an additional authentication method. Enforce least privilege policies. I've mentioned that earlier attacks. This essentially reducing the excessive access, making sure that the scope of the access to the repositories is limited to what on a needed basis. The third one is to continuously scan source code repos for secrets and access keys. In this attack, as mentioned, the attacker were aiming to these .npmrc files that are presumably will using or holding access keys or secrets. And at this time, we want to make sure that they're not holding anything that is sensitive from this perspective by scanning and even preventing that from entering to the source code repo itself. And the last is follow the branch protection rules, and also the open source packages best practices. Because in this, again, ESLint was tampered, or the attack was on open source package itself. So by best practices for open source, I'm referring to avoid auto-merge dependency upgrades. Don't auto-merge specifically. Use a lock file to prevent that auto-install of new packages, and make sure that you do that in a controlled way so you won't consume any new versions of the open source library that you're using without supervision, or at least without knowing the impact of that. Next slide, please.
So I think we're ready for poll number 3.
All right, great. Here comes poll number 3 coming your way. The question is, what is your highest priority to reduce risk to software supply chain attack? Enforcing a least privilege policy, detecting secrets in code, enforcing strong authentication policies, inserting security into breach protection rules, or something else. Go ahead and make your selection. Just a quick reminder, the open poll is listed in the poll category there, or the poll section on the interface, so you can find it there. And as with the other polls, we'll go ahead and leave this open for a minute or so to let everybody make their selection. And a quick reminder that we are going to be doing question and answer. Hopefully, we're going to have time for question and answer period during today's presentation. So go ahead and use the Q&A interface to submit your questions. And also today's event is being recorded as always, so you will have the opportunity to access it later on demand if you feel like listening to it again, or if you missed any or all of the webinars. So we are happy to have the webinar available to you on demand. It's also going to be on the Security Boulevard website. You can always go find it there. Just go to securityboulevard.com/webinars and look in the on-demand section after today's webinar has completed, and you'll find it there. All right, guys, we are doing well with our responses. We've gotten a lot in real quick. I'm going to leave it open for about 10 more seconds to let everybody make their final selection. Then I'll close the poll and we'll take a look at the results. All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and close it down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, the poll is now closed. Look, the question again was, what is your highest priority to reduce software supply chain attack? Looking at the numbers, looks like the highest percentage of folks, 30%, said enforcing a least privilege policy is their highest priority, and that was seconded by 25% enforcing strong authentication policies. And then after that, it was detecting secrets in code by 20% and something else by 15%. And 10% said inserting security into branch protection rules. So it looks like folks are pretty much all over the map when it comes to their highest priority to reducing risk in their software supply chain. So interesting results there.
Yeah, those are interesting results. You know, the least privilege policy, that makes a ton of sense to me. A little interesting to see branch protection rules so low. I would have expected them to maybe be a little bit higher, but everybody's got different environments and different priorities. So interesting to learn.
True that. All right, I'll put myself back on mute.
Great. Yeah, definitely agree with Andrew. Very interesting and kind of aligned with the summary and key takeaways that I want to share with you now that we reviewed the different attacks more in details. So supply chain attacks, we already know that it's not a new phenomenon, and it's on the rise. It can actually you can actually protect your compromise by one of the vendors that you use. But in this webinar, we're focusing on how to protect your supply chain attack itself. An organization can be compromised, or their supply chain can be compromised by achieving either or one or more, gaining access to their DevOps build pipeline, gaining access to the developer account to tamper code. We've covered that in the deep dive, or compromising open source dependencies. And again, we've witnessed several examples that are not SolarWinds happened, and we definitely believe that created a lot of negative impact. And I think that the third key takeaway is that we see developers as becoming more and more the primary target for attacks. And again, it's a good example. For example, you can see in the Sawfish phishing campaign. And why is that? Because developers have access to all the organization critical assets, as mentioned, projects, production environments, access keys, passwords, and so on and so forth. And they're also a huge potential, and due to that and more, they're also a huge potential for escalation of access. Again, almost in every attacker objectives. Next slide, please. So what are the actions that we want to take? What are the key takeaways that we want everyone in this audience, attendees, to see? And we've kind of listed here of 1 to 6 and mapped them to the 3 main attacks that we covered as a deep dive. And as you can see from a high level, that all these that were actually mentioned in the poll, that everyone is all over the place, are as a common denominator for every attack that we witness and more. So let's just go over them very briefly to make sure that we are all understanding. So the first one, least privilege model, was mentioned also as a higher priority in the poll. Reduce access to the minimum, avoid excessive access, just make sure that every developer has the right access that he needs. Secondly, strong authentication, multi-factor authentication configured for every user, for every repo, use single sign-on and such to make sure that the authentication is in the high degree as possible. The third one is secret detection. Review the code that is being pushed, so no secrets will be entered as shift left as possible, and continuously scan your code to detect any secrets in private repo and in public repo to make sure that there aren't any, and if so, revoked and held them as soon as possible. Branch protection rules was a little higher, lower in priority, but still very important. Run commits on the code to make sure that the code is not tampered. Add a review process so code will not be pushed mistakenly or not by attacker or even by developer with sensitive information to your main branch, to your code without an additional eye, without review. The open source development best practices on auto merge and lock file are also important things, but they are not the main things that we wanted to convey. Also, as well as the code scanning, whether it's fast, that's scanning your study code or your open source code. These two are important. They're important actions to take, but there is more that needs to be done. And this is, I think, where we are today and the action that we recommend you to take in order to essentially reduce the vulnerability, your vulnerability, for future supply chain attacks. So with that in mind, I think, Ronan, we can go over to the demo. I assume we have some time.
So we've got about 3 minutes. So we'll do why don't we do a real quick demo, Ronan?
Yeah, sure, no problem. So while I set it up, just to answer Mike's questions on SolarWinds, So essentially, we don't know how it was discovered. Essentially, first of all, like FireEye had a major. Do you see my screen?
No.
No.
Yep, there it is. It just showed up.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just to finish the answer, so essentially, FireEye's tools were leaked, so FireEye knew that they had a breach, and essentially FireEye detected that someone added a device to one of their developers, a sort of another MFA device. Then they contacted him. He told them that he didn't, and then like everything since that point is history. So back to the demo. So essentially, the way the platform works is that we integrate with the leading source controls in the market. We pull, digest, and analyze the data that exists there. And essentially related to the demo that we just showed you. So we look at the various issues that Amnon had raised. So essentially, the first one is reaching a least privilege access model in the source control and looking at the access configuration. So for example, making sure that you have two-factor authentication enforced on your organization, or detecting users that don't have it. But then as well, looking at each individual developer's permission, what are they actually doing, and then moving to a least privilege access model. So if someone has a right permission to a repository, but they're not using it, maybe they don't need this permission, and you'll be able to reduce it directly through the platform. The second aspect is around the configuration of the repositories themselves and the security of these repositories. So the first issue that was already mentioned here is the branch protection. So you would want to make sure that all your repositories that go to production has these branch protection rules enabled, and if they're not, so you would want to set them up, and then you would want to make sure that these rules are indeed not violated, and whenever they are violated, so we can let you know. The third aspect that was raised here is the dependency vulnerabilities. So this is something that a lot of SCMs actually now offer as part of their offering. So for example, if it's something that you need to turn on, so you would need to make sure that in all your repositories you have this configuration of a scanning for a dependency vulnerabilities. If it's not, turn it on and see these issues. As well as we aggregate the data from these detectors and show you an aggregated view of the various risks that you have regarding these libraries. And the first aspect that relates to the demo is detecting the secrets that are exposed in your code base. This would be something that attackers can take advantage of, and are really important when it comes to the security and hardening of your source code repositories. Let me jump to the last slide, which is this. So Andrew, we can do a quick Q&A, or maybe we don't have time. I'm not sure.
If we have time, yeah.
Charlene, that's your call, I think.
Yeah, it's tight, but let's see if we can get one in for you, okay? Okay, let's see. Mike has a great comment and question. Too much attention in the industry in general has been given to telling us about SolarWinds' attack on the development environment, how that happened with known passwords, etc. But very little has been told about detecting persistent malware of those affected by Sunburst and how that was detected. Do you know if that has been classified? Is that something that we just haven't discussed?
Yeah, so I don't think it's classified, and I think like I mentioned, like for FireEye, they explained how they detected it. It was someone having this MFA device added, and then like there were indicators of the SolarWinds incident, so you could see an activity log, and these companies were able to trace back like all the logs that they should have noticed. Obviously, it's easy to detect them once you know that the attack happened, but essentially you have XDR tools that this is what they exist for, and they look at all the activity across the organization infrastructure, and the purpose for them is to detect it by looking at the privileges escalation and new created accounts and things like that.
All right. All right, guys. Yeah, unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for question and answer. We only have like 1 minute left. So real quick, I've let you guys know about the webinar on demand. Let's real quick blow through the Amazon gift card winners today. They are Stephen L., Joseph W., Beth J., and Mark S. So congratulations to all 4 of you. We'll be following up with you via email to get your Amazon gift cards over to you. Amnon, Andrew, and Ronan, thank you all 3 for such a great presentation. I apologize we didn't have more time for question and answer, but to everybody who did submit questions and we didn't get to them, please know that that the folks will be getting a copy of all of the questions that came in, and I'm sure they'll be more than happy to follow up with you offline. So thank you to our presenters today, and thank you to the audience for joining me. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody, and please stay safe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.